Something very odd happened to the Woodstock generation in the 1980s. That 60s idealism was lost. Reagan came in America, Thatcher in Britain, yuppieism. I mean, it was the creed of greed. And it was as if all of the values that they had stood for and fought for were now being trashed in the dust. And it clearly had a profound effect on people like Dylan, on people like Neil Young, and it had a very adverse effect on some of their art as well. I mean, Dylan found God. Neil Young flirted with right-wing politics. I mean, he made some very odd pro-Reagan comments in the 1980s. And it didn't happen to those who'd come through a little bit later, the post-60s generation, the Springsteens and the Tom Waits. You don't see it happening there. It seems to be specific to the people who grew up in this era of civil rights and 1960s idealism, those people who thought that music was a tool in forging a new world and a better world. And it was if the disappointment and the disillusion of that, when it didn't happen, when it all went wrong, sort of turned in on their own music and had a very bad effect.
Neil Young at that time was lost, and you know, if you make a series of records that are increasingly uncommercial, or they don't seem to have the Neil Young signature quality about them as something like Rust Never Sleeps did. He certainly wasn't doing a Rust Never Sleeps during this period. He wasn't constructing anything. He was just letting it come out of him he didn't seem to be in control of the artistic process as much as just letting it happen and seeing where it took him, and caused a lot of confusion to his audience at the time, which of course was no bad thing as it turned out.
Towards the end of the 1980s, Young finally broke free from Geffen's clutches and returned to Reprise Records. The album he began working on was based upon yet another genre experiment, big band blues. With a new group behind him, Young produced some of his most cohesive work of the decade, and the album, This Note's For You, was released in April 1988.
When he announces he's doing a blues record, This Note's For You, you think, oh my God, not another genre experiment. But for me, it worked. For the first time, I thought it was actually a very strong and cohesive record. I liked the guitar work on it, I liked the mood of the songs. There was much on it to be recommended. And it was the first sign also of a certain Neil Young critical rehabilitation. That record received a 5-star review in Q magazine, which was astonishing at the time, 5 stars. Particularly after the run that he'd had. And I think it was a cause of great celebration amongst many of us. You can see that Neil Young was finding himself again, that the creative juices were starting to flow, that although he was still doing the genre experimentation, it seemed, and playing with roles, trying to escape, as he said, in disguises throughout that decade, doing a bit of the old method acting, and here he was again playing a role. But this is a role that you could actually, I genuinely believed, it wasn't just a Blues Brothers pastiche or something. I think it was a lot more to that. The songs seemed to have a lot more depth to them. They seemed to be, very personal songs at the same time that they were dramatic constructions as well. So when he talked about adultery in a song or whatever, it sounded quite clever. I didn't feel the sense of artifice that I felt about certain other of the Neil Young genre records at the time, where you throw your hands up and say, why is he doing this? I think he'd found something here that did work musically, and as it turned out, it was both the end of something, the end of a series of genre experiments, and at the same time a bridge towards freedom, as it were, and the new Neil Young that came out thereafter.
Young followed This Note's For You by returning to the Crosby, Stills and Nash fold, and the four-piece released a new album, American Dream. Following its release, Young returned to the studio to work on a new solo record, initially called Times Square. Yet after its completion, he again had a change of heart and recorded 6 new tracks and retitled the album Freedom.
Times Square is an album, and it's an entity unto itself, and Freedom is the attempt to take that and turn it into a quintessential Neil Young album. But what he ends up with is an album that doesn't suggest anything like the movement, the forward motion that Times Square would have. You end up with a Neil Young album that will appeal to his old fans because it has a lot of elements of the old Neil Young. Indeed, it's got whole songs that are 12 years old on it. But it's also got elements of Times Square. But of course, they're elements and they're taken out of context. Then, bizarrely enough, he writes a new song which is of the same mould as Times Square, which is Rockin' in the Free World, and sticks that on. And suddenly you've got another hit, which he hasn't had for a long time, and also people celebrating this, what is seen very much as a comeback. And it is. I mean, Freedom is on, you know, again, if you put it on, you say this is a damn fine album.
Rockin' in the Free World was much commented upon at the time because, you know, of what Neil Young was seemingly saying politically. And it's a bit like, I suppose a bit like, you know, Bruce Springsteen or something in Born in the USA, let's say. Much misinterpreted song, but it's a song that's anthemic, that everybody puts their hands in the air if they don't know actually what he's talking about.
Born in the USA, I was born in the USA, I was born in the USA, I'm a long gone daddy in the USA now.
Rather like Born in the USA, it's quite a severe critique as well of what's happening in America. It's not a punch in the air patriotic song in a way that Springsteen's wasn't either. But does that really matter? Because everybody at a concert just wants to sing along with it, and so it achieves that too. It's very clever, I suppose, in that sense, and also as what may well be, you know, one of Neil Young's definitive TV performances, where he just blasts through it. That footage, which anybody has seen on Saturday Night Live, is one of the great TV performances of Neil Young. It's the perfect song to do it in. It has everything. He just bursts out of the screen, almost killing himself doing Rockin' in the Free World.
Somehow, whether by luck or design, he hits the moment again with a song like Rocking in the Free World, you know, just as the Berlin Wall is about to come down, and that song becomes almost a soundtrack for that. And it's after a period of being lost for almost a decade, miraculously, somehow he comes back in a perfect fit with the times, and it all comes together. And it's reflected in the music, and it's the best record he's made since 1979. And you then ask yourself, is it the best record simply because the songs are good and the playing is good and he's focused again, or is it the best record because somehow he's come back into this fit with the times, and he was actually out of step for most of the 80s, you know, even though he was sort of making these pro-Reagan comments and so on and so forth. You knew in his heart he was still that old 60s idealistic hippie, and he was a man out of his time, and somehow he comes back into his time in 1989, and that's what you hear on Freedom.
Boosted by a critical and commercial revival, and apparently having hit a new creative stride, Young reunited with his Crazy Horse cohorts for the album Ragged Glory.
Ragged Glory is a mess. And I think there's probably a good album in there. But Neil Young is suffering from the disease that curses just about all his contemporaries at that point with exception of Dylan, which is CD-itis. The belief that because there's 72 minutes of playing time, he needs to fill it. And instead of issuing great 35-minute albums, he issues deeply flawed 65-minute albums. And that, unfortunately, is really the curse of freedom, if you like. That's really the point at which he loses that sense of how do you retain the integrity of an album. And it was a thing that he'd intermittently got absolutely right. The one thing he certainly did get right is this idea that, you know, don't over-egg it. Don't. And whereas Ragged Glory is, hey, I can play this style, that style, I can play old songs, I can play new songs, yeah, you can, but actually, you know what? It's a mess.
It's difficult talking about the albums that Neil Young made in the late 80s and early 90s because they come on the back of, you know, such a batch of terrible records that you're kind of grateful that he's making anything that doesn't suck, and certainly those records don't suck. I still don't think Ragged Glory stands alongside the records he was making in the late 60s and early 70s. But comparatively, it's a major return to form.
With both Freedom and Ragged Glory, Young had re-established his rock credentials, and younger musicians drawn to his earlier work were discovering something unique and vital. This influence was observed in the new rock movement labelled grunge, which by the early 90s had grown from a West Coast to a global phenomenon. And again, Young was being hailed as the godfather to a new generation of rock musicians.
The idea of Neil Young as the godfather of grunge seems to me to have a lot more logic than the notion of him as the grand old man of punk. Because in a way, you know, he invented grunge guitar. I mean, a lot of other people did as well, you know, but you listen to that sort of snarling tone that he perfected, going right back to Cowgirl in the Sand and Down by the River and Cinnamon Girl on Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. You know, you can see where that guitar sound that came out of Seattle had its roots, and Neil Young was very much part of those roots. So it seemed to make far more sense to me that people like Kurt Cobain and Eddie Vedder found an empathy with Neil Young than you know, the Sex Pistols and the Clash had done 15 years earlier.
It's interesting that when I went down to interview him for my book Don't Be Denied in December of 1991, Ragged Glory, you know, had at that time sort of brought Neil back to the Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere kind of sound, and became sort of ground zero for the whole grunge movement at that time. And he said that what inspired him to record that album and to get back to that sound was really digging back through his own archives. He had already started as far back as you know, 1990 to go through his own archives and start listening to his own stuff, his early stuff, and be influenced by it. And it was playing songs like Farmer John and remembering what that was like, and remembering the thrill of playing these you know, really rockin' songs and having fun with them that kind of brought him back to that. And, you know, again, and that's kind of the start of the whole grunge movement.
Obviously, there's something nice to be thought of as the godfather of grunge, you know, but the irony of it is it's not there, you know. You can look high and low. I'm sorry, you know, Neil Young as an influence on grunge? No. As an influence on Eddie Vedder? Yes. But then Eddie Vedder's key influences include James Taylor, you know. It's not grunge. It's not, and you know, making an album by turning your amp up to 11 doesn't make it grunge.
After igniting a new wave of interest in his work with the electric albums Freedom and Ragged Glory, Young finally decided to return to the terrain that had established him as a global star in 1972. With Harvest Moon, it appeared that finally he had created the long-avoided follow-up to his most famous album.